Good evening, everyone. We might make a start. I'm Beverly Loke. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the Corabell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. And I'm also the co-convener of the CIW China Seminar Series, both housed within the College of Asia and the Pacific. Let me start by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional unceded lands that we gather on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I recognize and celebrate their continuing commitment to connection to lands, waters, and community, and I think as a community of scholars gathered here today, we are grateful and indeed very privileged to work, live, and learn on this land. So thank you for sharing this land with us. A very warm welcome to this evening's event, this roundtable, Reimagining Global Order, China's Order Building Ideas, Practices, and Narratives, co-hosted by the ANU Australian Centre on China and the World and the Department of International Relations. It's great to see everyone here today. Thank you for coming. As we grapple, I think, with the drivers, intentions, and effects of China's order building initiatives in a very fractured and fragmented world. This week in particular seems particularly especially to be about world orders. Earlier this week on Tuesday, we had Professor Amitav Acharya speak to us about his book, The Once and Future World Order, where he talked about the decline of the US-led world order. And I'm sure many of us, many questions perhaps will also be directed to the panel about the events occurring as we speak, the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing right now. This roundtable comes at the end of a two-day workshop that we've been having that have involved scholars from Singapore, China, Australia, the US, and the UK, speaking particularly on this very topic. The intention is to have our papers published in a special issue journal, so please stay tuned for that. And I'm very grateful for CIW funding for this workshop, which has really allowed this wonderful community of Chinese IR scholars to come together. I also want to give my vote of thanks to Sharon Strange at CIW and also to Kian Kumul, who is taking photographs at the back. Thank you very much for all your assistance in putting together this evening's roundtable. So we have in this evening's roundtable a fairly diverse group of scholars here in terms of how they approach China and order building. And so I've really asked each panelist to come to this question here from their particular area of expertise. So to guide the discussion, I've also provided a set of 3 questions. So let me just walk you through the framing questions. The first is drawing on your particular research expertise. How and in what ways is China order building shaping or reshaping global order and global ordering? What are the key drivers and intentions? 2, what for you are the key contestations, tensions, and contradictions embedded within China's order building initiatives? How are these dynamics playing out? And number 3, how useful is it to think about all of this through the context of reimagining world order? So let me very briefly introduce this brilliant panel, and we'll go in the order of who will be speaking first. So first up, we have Xiaoyi Pu, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno. He is the author of a 2019 Stanford University Press book, Rebranding China, Contested Status Signaling and the Changing Global Order. And he's published in numerous widely leading journals such as International Security, International Affairs, and the Chinese Journal of International Politics. Second, we have Professor Astrid Norden, who is the Lau Chair of Chinese International Relations in the Lau China Institute at King's College London, before which she was Professor of World Politics and Founding Director of Lancaster University China Center. Her research develops critical conceptual tools that draw on Chinese and other global traditions of thought and uses this to challenge global challenges as they relate to China's growing global role. Third, we have Hannah Bailey, who is an assistant professor at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, where her research and teaching sits at the intersection of international relations and emerging technologies. Her work examines how authoritarian states, in particular China, develop and deploy emerging technologies for state-sponsored digital persuasion in the global public sphere. Last but not least, Guangyi Pan, who is a lecturer in international political studies at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at UNSW Canberra. His research primarily focuses on asymmetric politics, China's alliance and alignment policy, Sino-Soviet relations, and neoclassical realism in IR. Guangyi has published also in multiple places, including International Affairs, International Relations of Asia Pacific, and Pacific Review. So the format for today's roundtable, we'll keep it brief, sort of brief comments, 10 minutes each. I think because they're all coming at this from their respective research areas, hopefully this will give us a really sort of stimulating first set of remarks for everyone to have a really enriching Q&A. So without further ado, Xiaoyi.
Okay, thank you.
So it's my great pleasure and honor to revisit ANU. 2 years ago, I was a visiting fellow at ANU. I big admire a lot of scholarship here at this university. ANU definitely has one of the best IR program. I'm definitely one of the best China program. So when we talk about China and global order, I think ANU is the fantastic place. In the past 2 days, we just finished a workshop talking about China and global order. I find an interesting tension. The tension is, to what degree we emphasize China as a unique case? How China's ideas, practices, China's visions of international order, does that reflect all the uniqueness or Chinese characteristics of this giant country? Or to some degree, China is a case of international relation theory. So I think there's some tension there, but I don't think this tension is bad. I think it's to some degree, this is the sort of academic distribution of labor. So when people focus on China as a case, as a unique case, typically they emphasize cultural history, deep tradition. That will help the examination to go deeper. And when we examine China as a case of international relation theory, that will help us see the bigger picture, see comparative perspective, and see the sort of general pattern. So my own approach typically emphasizes China as a case of international relations, not a sort of focus on China as much too unique. But again, I think this tension is really sort of constructive for all of us to understand China comprehensively. So that's my first point. Then, when we think about China's relationship with global order, I think when we think about the bigger picture, I would like to borrow Dr. Henry Kissinger's formulation. When he talked about the world order, he always emphasized two variables. One is distribution of power. Second is international legitimacy. So basically, Kissinger think about every international order eventually face pressures from two sources. One is a shift in the balance of power. Second is a redefinition of international legitimacy. International legitimacy means the rule of the game, norms, and other sort of normative or sort of preferences of the rule of the game in the international system. So to some degree, one of my earlier articles, many years ago, I co-authored with Professor Randall Schroeder, called After Unipolarity. We basically highlight international system is now facing two processes. One is deconcentration of power. That means that there is a diffusion of material power away from the United States and the West more broadly. But again, this does not mean the United States power is over. Today, the United States is still very powerful, and so but it's not as dominant as before. The second is delegitimation. This process means the growing contestation over the rule and norms in the existing order. China's rise, second, certainly raise a lot of questions. What kind of rule of the game, what kind of norms China will bring to the international system? So again, if we try to understand China and global order, we need to try to figure out what is China's power position in the global balance of power. Second is, what is China's normative preferences? How that China's preferences shape the international legitimacy? So then, the second question, the following question is, how is China reshaping global order in a specific sense? So we see China's behaviors are really not like a single sort of one-dimensional. China really, on the one hand, China is challenging the current international order to some degree, creating a lot of non-Western institutions, such as AIIB, BRICS, and other institutions. Second, China still invested a lot in the existing major institutions, like the United Nations and all World Bank, International Monetary Fund. So China is not withdraw from the current system. Thirdly, China sometimes has a tendency to be a shirker, trying to not take greater responsibility, trying to focus on domestic growth. So we see China's behavior, how China is thinking, China is dealing with existing order has all kinds of different dimensions. Then the next question is, what are the key tensions and contradictions in China's order building? I find there are multiple interesting tensions or contradictions. The first is the tension between change and stability. So China definitely has rising power. China wants to change the system. But China has also benefited a lot from the current international system, from the current order. So in that sense, China wants stability. So right, this is the first tension. The second tension is between anti-hegemonic rhetoric and hierarchical and coercive practices. So if we read the Chinese foreign policy rhetoric, all highlight fantastic world, harmonious world, all countries are equal. But in reality, China, as a great power, also practices a lot of sort of building its own coercive leverage, and also using coercion, especially in economic statecraft. And so in that sense, China also, so there's a tension between anti-hegemonic rhetoric, but also hierarchical and coercive practice. The third tension is between China's global ambition and the domestic and other constraints. So nowadays, China definitely is a global power, but it's not like another superpower. There are many constraints or limitations regarding China's power. So my final conclusion is that is reimagining global order a helpful way to think about all of this? I think it's kind of yes and no. Reimagining global order is a helpful sort of framework because we need to see beyond the Western-dominated world order when we think about the impact of China. However, if we think about like, okay, reimagining global order with China, does that mean China has a single coherent alternative vision of global order? I think that's more contested. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that, Xiaoyu. You've set me up quite nicely, and also thank you to Beverly and to ANU for having us here for this really interesting discussion we've been having over the last couple of days, and on this super excellently timed evening as well, given the conversations that are underway in Beijing, which have circled around everything from trade to Iran, from fentanyl to Taiwan. And Xi and Trump, I think, have tried to please numerous different constituencies by coming across as firm and confident and indeed powerful in shaping world order. And we see this in handshakes and press releases and guest lists and temple visits. But But I want to suggest that something deeper is also visible in the atmosphere surrounding the visit. A global vibe shift in how political authority itself is felt and judged. And so today I want to suggest that China is not only changing the balance of power, but it's reshaping the emotional conditions under which global order is experienced, contested, and indeed legitimized. This global vibe shift is far broader, deeper, and longer in the making than today's meetings, and indeed it is more than some Trumpian anti-woke turn with a bit of China maxing sprinkled in. So to understand this vibe shift, we need to move beyond the assumption that some have had that the United States and its allies once enjoyed stable moral leadership that has only recently come under pressure. For many across the world, this so-called liberal or rules-based order never felt especially liberal or orderly in the first place. So as we all know, colonial violence, military interventionism, exploitative economic restructuring, and highly selective humanitarianism have long shaped skepticism towards claims to Western universal authority. What's changing today, I think, is not the sudden confession or discovery of Western hypocrisy, but it's the weakening ability of the US and its allies to dismiss criticism as resentment or propaganda, emotional grounds. And China has become really central in this shift. China's rise is often analysed through military power, trade, technology, and geopolitics, and all of those things matter, and I'm sure more of my colleagues will talk about those too. But Beijing's order building also operates at the level of feeling. So China increasingly functions as a site through which frustrations with global hierarchy, violence, and hypocrisy are articulated, amplified, and made materially plausible. And this frustration, I think, is increasingly accompanied by something more hopeful, a newly emboldened post-colonial glee. And this glee is not simply triumphalism or naive celebration of China. It's the effective release that comes when the authority long experienced as overbearing, patronizing, and hypocritical begins to lose some of its monopoly on deciding who gets to feel what. So it can be sensed in the enthusiasm surrounding BRICS expansion, in online celebrations of Western diplomatic affairs, and in the hopeful rhetoric of a global South moment that we've seen people like Wang Yi, the Chinese minister, express. So the feeling is often less China will lead us than the West no longer gets to speak for everyone else. And China matters because its rise makes that feeling seem materially grounded rather than more aspirational. Now, China has both contributed to and benefited from this atmosphere, even where enthusiasm for Beijing itself remains limited. So when Chinese officials speak about multipolarity, sovereignty, or a global South moment, they're not simply making strategic arguments. They are speaking into a broader emotional landscape in which the authority of the US and its allies increasingly feels arrogant, hypocritical, and indeed exhausted and exhausting. And this emotional shift does not require that people see China as innocent, consistent, or morally superior. It also does not mean that people or leaders across the global South are rallying behind Beijing. Many remain very wary of Chinese power, debt dependence, and regional coercion. China's own order building contains profound contradictions. Beijing condemns hegemony while intimidating neighbors in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. It invokes sovereignty internationally while imposing deeply securitized governance in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And it criticizes interventionism while using economic leverage quite aggressively against small states. But these contradictions do not cancel out the palpable plea of many across and beyond the global south, to whom China represents the ability to confidently refuse any claims by the United States and allies to emotional authority. In some ways, they make it more intelligible to troops and societies that never believed great powers behaved morally in the first place. China's significance lies less in offering a coherent alternative model than in widening the emotional horizon of what various actors believe they can refuse, demand, or imagine. Now, China's technological capacity, infrastructure projects, manufacturing scale, and diplomatic reach make a less Western-centered world feel increasingly possible or indeed inevitable. Institutions like BRICS matter partly because they produce this emotional effect that sends, and sometimes the glee, that global politics no longer has their single center. And this, to round things off, is why thinking about reimagining global order is useful but also incomplete. The current transformation is not simply about replacing American leadership with Chinese leadership. It's about a wider redistribution of emotional authority across world politics. So whose grievance sounds legitimate, whose suffering matters, whose anger resonates with whom, and whose future feels hopeful. China didn't create those feelings, but its rise has made them harder to dismiss and easier to share across parts of the world. So the global vibe shift, I think, is therefore not simply about geopolitics or about negotiations between two delegations in Beijing. It's about the fading emotional grip of Western authority and the growing sense that felt with anger, relief, hope, sometimes outrightly, that the world no longer has to feel quite so centered. That's the way. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you again, Beverly, for organizing this wonderful event. I flew all the way from Pittsburgh to be here, from Carnegie Mellon, and I'm delighted to be, if not a bit jet lagged, to be here. So I'm Hannah Bailey. I come at this, I come at China, my analysis of China from a slightly different angle. So my background's in a mixture between computer science and political science. So I have a particular interest in technology and technology governance. And in particular, I see China's order building less as a question of replacing one hegemon with another, and more as a question of kind of governance competition between different rival states. So, China's trying to establish its governance reputation, its governance stature in a whole host of domains, some of which are more successful than others. But the areas in which we see China be most successful are the areas that are the newest. So technologies that are emerging, domains that didn't exist before, China will have first mover advantage. No one's governed these technologies before, no one's said anything about these before, so China, sets up a new institution, a new set of partnerships, a new grouping of nation states, gets together and starts governing. And that's really important because China is then able to more effectively contest and set norms surrounding standard setting in these new domains, who defines the notion of responsible governance of these new technologies, who provides the infrastructure for these technologies, who controls the tech dependencies that come along with those new emerging technologies, and whose model of development is treated as more legitimate than others. So, again, I'm biased, but I see technology as quite an important domain for thinking about this and thinking about what kind of systems China is looking to build and what potential assumptions are built into these new systems. It's an area where we can really have a look and see what is China trying to do, what is it trying to achieve, what order is it trying to build here. In particular, you just have a look at, the buzzword of the moment, AI, right? There's the kind of, we might call, model building software component that goes along with that, but there's also a whole host of other physical infrastructures, data centers that go along with that. China also is particularly interested in telecom, surveillance tools. China's very, very interested in technology and also in building the governance infrastructures that surrounding that. So grand order building narratives are, important. They matter, as we all know. But tech is often where these order building narratives become particularly operational, where we see them emerge and we see that become reality. So if a state uses China's digital infrastructure, if it joins China-led standards, and is kind of entering into a governance relationship with China, that can then bring benefits to those countries, undoubtedly, but also dependencies and vulnerabilities that we're starting to see there. And this is because China's technological appeal is often fairly practical. States that are looking to build telecoms infrastructures that are using to build computing resources, they don't really think about, democratic AI and these other, notions that come along with that. They just kind of want those raw resources. But of course, building those resources then creates longer-term dependencies and then builds that base from which China can establish more of an order building grounding. So a road or a bridge may create debt or maintenance obligations, but tech can also create arguably more deeper forms of dependence. So data dependence. A lot of AI models require huge swathes of data to create reliable models. Who provides the data? China has a huge volume, swathe of domestic data that it can use and operationalize and then provide to other states potentially as a source for data there. There's also standards dependence, right? If China is able to set the standards for new tech, then that becomes a mode of dependence if China's kind of setting the agenda there. There's also cybersecurity dependence, as we've seen with models coming out of Anthropic. These models are able to identify cybersecurity vulnerabilities, but then are also able to act as plugs to, fill those or target those cybersecurity vulnerabilities. But then that creates a dependency on these models. We're now dependent on Anthropic to identify a lot of our vulnerabilities in these models. So again, if China is able to do that and build those models, creates a dependency. And there's infrastructure lock-in. So we have data centers, we have all these kinds of physical infrastructures that go along with these technologies that once they're built, and they're owned by who they're owned by, and then, if you start using them, you're kind of dependent on those resources. So the politics of tech is often a kind of, we talk about it in terms of dependence, and that's important when we're thinking about China's role in building these infrastructures and norms. But China's not the only one to play this game, of course. We also have, a lot of Western states that have quite successfully, the US, by and large, built a lot of platforms, physical infrastructure as well, upon which the rest of the world relies heavily. From social media platforms to search engines, a lot of the tech that we rely on is Western-centric. That's not to say that China doesn't have its own equivalent tech alternatives, but the rest of the world doesn't really use them. It's kind of an area in which China has lost the tech game, so to speak. But China is now realizing that in emerging areas such as AI, building the infrastructure, setting standards early are important tools for order building. And China's model here is very interesting because it's very distinctive, because it places a strong emphasis on sovereignty, on state authority, and on social stability. And that's often very different from the norms that we see Western states trying to embed in their technologies. Actually, I just have a question. Can anyone put their hand up if they use an AI model today, be it chat, be it a Google search? Okay. Hands up if anyone used DeepSeek today, or any Chinese model. Okay, we have a far smaller set of hands. And that goes to illustrate, by and large, the continuation of the Western, dominance in this space. We all, by and large, use US Western tech. We don't tend to use the China equivalent, despite China's efforts to build these norms surrounding that. And then, in using these models, there's often ideological values that are embedded within these models. These OpenAI, Anthropic have whole teams on what they call alignment, which is to align these models on values. Usually they're Western democratic values. But DeepSeek and other models align on more Chinese values. However, they, as we see, they have different degrees of success in exporting these models to global audiences. That in itself is an important tool of, order building, of spreading these values to a global audience that we haven't seen in the same way before. So the US kind of continues to win the game, but that's not to say that China's not trying. China's trying to make a marked effort to set standards, which are often less visible, but are still going on, particularly in market access, in standard setting, in surveillance capacities. So oftentimes China exports surveillance capacity and surveillance norms, and in procurement rules. So states are often, sometimes choosing between Western technology and Chinese technology, and oftentimes becoming, reliant on there. And China's tech can be, alternatives can be beneficial to a lot of states, in particular to global South states, but it also creates dependencies. It creates kind of knock-on physical infrastructure dependencies, data dependencies that we don't always see below the surface. And they also create powerful new vectors for influence, for spreading ideology, and for potentially influencing new audiences in new ways. So, with that, I will wrap up, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion on this.
Well, thank you. Thank you to David for organizing today's session. I really enjoyed the workshop these 2 days, and also happy to share some of my thoughts about China order shaping behavior in today's world. Based on our discussion, I think there are several ways to look at how China is going to shape a regional or global order. You can look at the institution, legitimacy, economy, emotion, for instance. My personal research field, my expertise is more about the military and the security policy in China, so I will analyze it from the view of security. I think what China is doing right now is to reinterpret the world order, security order through alignment or new kind of formal alignments, non-binding, without treaty ally, but it was going to build the military alignment. For instance, we can look at, because the current international order or security orders based on alliance in the past 500 years, First World War, Second World War, Cold War, and even today. But China says, no, we are going to reject this term. Alliance is Cold War minded, it's a legacy of the Cold War. I look at today China-Russia alignment, I'm using the word alignment, not alliance. I think it's a pretty good example of how do they reinterpret the meaning and the policy implications of alliance. You see, China and Russia now, they have a so-called no limit partnership, which China and Russia had a very high level of political coordination. Xi and Putin have met more than 40 times since 2010, and also they have routinized, institutionalized the dialogue. The Chinese government and the Russian government, they will meet every 2 weeks to talk about and for the strategic coordination, and also look at the operational level, joint exercise from Navy to Army to Air Force, armed trade. China is the first international buyer of Su-35 and S-400 system. They had a lot of joint exercise, also including the early warning missile system. This is a sovereignty level military exercise. So if you look at all of these features, you will say, yeah, they are de facto alliance, but in reality, they are not, right? Li Jiazhu went to Moscow saying, if you are going to invade, we understand what Russia is doing to Ukraine, we will support, we will provide coordination, right, as we can. But there's no commitment, security commitment provided by China. So if you look at all of this behavior by Chinese approach, you'll find out that China is reshaping the world order, security order through a non-binding alignment approach. They have lots of platforms. We put it in a broader pattern. They have lots of platforms, forums looking at coordination, consultation, dialogue, but there's no clear commitment from China. I think a good comparison is look at Russian and also North Korean. North Korea is China's only treaty ally, but there's no military exchange between these two countries, no deals, no joint exercise, so on and so forth. So someone wonder why China is doing that. I think there's 3 drivers. The first one is, of course, the regime security. China is looking at how to secure the neighborhoods, international environment for economic and social development, but also what Beijing wants to is to have to keep the strategic flexibility and independence, not to be dragged along by Moscow or Pyongyang into unnecessary conflict. And the second is the military modernization. You would say today PLA is a very formidable, powerful military in the world, which is true, but still PLA has no real experience of combat or battle, which is good news. But if you look at military modernization, PLA still needs someone to tell them, to teach them how to fight in a real battlefield. So in that sense, the Russian military is a good source, and also some may argue Russia is in decline, the military in decline, but Russia is still a very big military power. So for the purpose of military modernization, China is going to reshape it through its own way to achieve this goal. And the final one, I will argue, is about replication. China reluctant to build an alliance network. It is because you have to take the responsibility or obligation. If your ally, your small brother was invited, you have to provide some security guarantee. But you have to undermine the strategic flexibility and independence. So for these three main reasons, that's why I'm thinking how and what and why China is reshaping the regional order. It comes down to the second question, the tensions and the contradictions. I think it's very clear. If you want to have strategic benefit from this approach, you have something to pay. You have to take the consequence, which is if you are not willing to take the responsibility obligation, it will undermine the strategic credibility. I think, as we discussed, Yan Shuotong may argue 10 years ago, saying if China wants to be a world leader, it needs an alliance network. It needs to be a leader to have its own allies. But China is reluctant to do that. And I think the clear consequence is that China is influential in some areas, for instance, in Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, because China has a hard power to play, has military influence. But if you look at Northeast Asia, China still cannot influence North Korea, cannot have the concrete achievement from the six-party talk to stop North Korea's nuclear program. Why? Because there's no military. Look at the PLA's North Theater Command. I think their main purpose was to stabilize the society after the crisis, instead of assisting North Korean People's Army to fight against the foreign power. So I think the consequence is very clear, is that you want to have the strategic flexibility and you may lose the reputation or credibility somehow because you don't want to take the obligation. And another tension in my view is that China is too big. So we have an issue of asymmetric structure, which the smaller states are looking at China, they are overly sensitive to every move of China, and they may misinterpret the Chinese action in certain area. For instance, in Indian Ocean, China escort operation, China has military port, which is not for certain things. I think it's a very normal expansion of the rising military power in China. But if you look at the current war in Iran and oil crisis, you would say China had decided to do it. China had decided to intervene, for instance, Indian Ocean or Africa, perhaps 10 years ago. This is not true. I think it's just because the misperception caused by this asymmetric structure. China as a great power, it looks at other great powers, right? Because they are attentive to the same great powers. To the smaller states like Australia, Singapore, Southeast Asian country, China is less tentative to that because we are not that important in their strategic or diplomatic circle. But as a smaller state, we are over-attentive, over-sensitive to China's behavior. So this structure caused several issues that every Chinese move would be spotlighted at international stage. So for that reason, this is a tension or contradiction in Chinese order-shaping behavior, is that if China is going to shape or make something or make a difference, it has to suffer lots of misinterpretation because China is too big and the other country cannot, smaller country cannot afford the consequence. They have to prepare for it. So they may be overreacting to certain things and trigger certain unnecessary dispute or contradictions. And the last one, reimagine. I really like this word, reimagine, because we are witnessing how the world order in transformation. But I may ask another question is who is reimagining? Is the great powers of China reimagine the world? I think we can see more continuities in Chinese diplomacy instead of changes. What China has used, the word language they have used in the statement had existed for like 4 decades. Nothing changed, like harmony, multilateralism, multipolarity. China has called for that since 1980s. But today China is still doing that. I think the changes didn't happen. Sometimes we may interpret certain media or news like this is a big transformation in Chinese diplomacy. I don't think so. I think China is just following the strategic way that had been set 10 years or 20 years ago. So I think it would be better to ask this one. Why are continuities not producing different systematic effects? Right? Why China is still doing what it did in 10 years, 20 years ago, but the way to explain, the way to interpret it had changed a lot. I think not just because of the structure, but also our mindset have changed, and also the way to look at China to explain the meaning, the political meanings of China's behavior have changed. Yeah, that's everything from me, and thank you.